Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller, Sr., by Ron Chernow. Introduction. A frail old man sits in a lounge chair in his grand mansion. He's in his late 70s, the richest man the world has ever known, a figure of myth and legend. For months, he has agreed to a strange exercise. His biographer reads aloud from the most savage attacks ever written against him, and he, John D. Rockefeller, Sr., will finally answer them, paragraph by paragraph. He listens calmly as the words of his chief accuser, the journalist Ida Tarbell, fill the room. She details his ruthless business tactics, his secret deals, his crushing of competitors. The old man is serene, his conscience clear. He believes God has blessed his career. But then, the biographer reads a single, venomous line. It's not about his business. It's about his father, a man long dead, a man of shadows and secrets. Tarbell writes that his father, William Avery Rockefeller, had all the vices save one: he never drank. And in that moment, the granite composure of the world's richest man shatters. He leaps from his chair, his face flushed, his eyes burning with a fire no one has seen before. What a wretched utterance from one calling herself a historian, he cries, his voice ringing through the room. He rails against the poisoned tongue of this poisoned woman, his famous self-control utterly gone. Why? Why did this one line, this jab at a long-dead father, pierce the armor of a man who had faced down presidents and withstood the hatred of a nation? The answer to that question is the secret key to understanding one of the most complex, controversial, and monumental figures in American history. And today, we're going to unlock it. We're about to dive into Ron Chernow's masterpiece, Titan, a book that has sold millions of copies and is widely considered the definitive biography of John D. Rockefeller, Sr. By the time we're done, you won't just understand how Rockefeller built the largest fortune in modern history, you'll understand the hidden psychological forces that drove him. You'll see the man behind the myth, a man of profound contradictions, part saint and part sinner, whose life offers timeless lessons about ambition, control, faith, and the true meaning of legacy. Book summary. To understand John D. Rockefeller, you have to understand that he was the product of two powerful, opposing forces. Two worlds that crashed together in his childhood and waged a war inside of him for the rest of his life. One world was his mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller. She was the very picture of piety, discipline, and thrift. A devout Baptist, she was a woman who bore immense hardship with a quiet, unshakable faith. Her life was orderly, her principles were firm, and her most common saying, when faced with a difficult decision, was, "We will let it simmer." She taught her son that willful waste makes woeful want, and that it was a religious duty to work, to save, and to give. And then, there was his other world. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, known to many as Big Bill, or, more ominously, Devil Bill. Imagine a character from a tall tale. Nearly 6 feet tall, with a booming voice, rugged good looks, and a charm so powerful it could disarm the most hardened skeptic. He was a crack shot who could win shooting contests, a gifted ventriloquist, and a traveling botanic physician who sold miracle cures from the back of a buggy. When he would return home after months of mysterious absence, his pockets would be bulging with cash, and he would regale his children with picaresque tales of his adventures. To his young son John, he was a giant, a man of incredible strength and talent, a Paul Bunyan-esque figure who embodied adventure and excitement. But Devil Bill had a secret. In fact, he had many. He was a flim-flam man, a con artist. The miracle cures were snake oil. The stories were embellished. And his life on the road was a tapestry of deception. Even his first meeting with Eliza was a ruse, He posed as a deaf-mute peddler to win her sympathy and gain access to her modestly wealthy family. The chaos he created was the backdrop of John's childhood. Devil Bill would disappear for months on end, leaving Eliza and the children to survive on credit at the local store, never knowing when or if he would return. The family lived in a state of constant uncertainty, swinging between periods of anxious scarcity and the sudden, brief abundance that came with Bill's return. But the deepest shame was hidden even from the children for many years. Shortly after marrying Eliza, Bill moved his mistress, Nancy Brown, into their tiny home as a housekeeper. He proceeded to have children with both his wife and his mistress, under the same roof. John Davison Rockefeller, named after his sober and upright grandfather, was born into this household steeped in sin, sandwiched between two illegitimate half-sisters. And it didn't stop there. Bill's life was a spiral of increasingly brazen deceptions. He was indicted for rape in 1849, forcing the family to flee town under a cloud of scandal. Later, he would lead a full-blown double life, marrying a second, younger woman named Margaret Allen while still married to Eliza. He became a bigamist, living under the alias Drive William Livingston, a name he would carry to his unmarked grave. This was the inferno that forged John D. Rockefeller. On one side, the godliness, order, and stability of his mother. On the other, the chaos, shame, and lawlessness of his father. He loved them both. And he would spend his entire life trying to reconcile these two warring halves of his soul. He inherited his father's daring and audacity, his mind for schemes and grand visions. But he channeled it all through the iron-willed discipline of his mother. He became a man obsessed with control. He learned to be silent, secretive, and wary of strangers. He developed a profound contempt for disorder, for unpredictability, for anything that smacked of his father's chaotic world. While other boys dreamed of adventure, John dreamed of balance sheets. Numbers were his salvation. They were clean, rational, and true. They could not lie. At just 7 years old, he started his first business, raising and selling turkeys. He kept a small red book, which he called Ledger A, and in it, he meticulously recorded every penny earned and spent. This ledger became his most sacred relic. It was more than just accounting. It was a moral code. It was his way of imposing a perfect, mathematical order onto a messy, unpredictable world. It was his first, small act of rebellion against the chaos of Devil Bill. That obsession with order is what drove him when, at 16, he began his legendary search for his first job in Cleveland in 1855. For 6 straight weeks, 6 days a week, he put on his only dark suit and made the rounds of the city's most prominent businesses, the railroads, the banks, the wholesale merchants. He wasn't just looking for any job, as he said, I was after something big. He faced constant rejection, but he never despaired. He saw the job hunt itself as a business, and he was its sole, determined employee. Finally, on September 26, 1855, a day he would celebrate for the rest of his life as Job Day, he was hired as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a firm of commission merchants. For Rockefeller, this wasn't just a job, it was an answered prayer. He was finally free. Free from his fickle father, free from the endless moving from town to town, free from the shame and uncertainty of his childhood. He poured himself into the work with a religious fervor. The world of commerce, he said, was delightful to me, all the method and system of the office. He saw ledgers as sacred books that revealed hidden truths. He approached every bill with a zealot's intensity, pouncing on errors of even a few cents. He developed a reputation as a young man who was unnervingly precise, methodical, and reliable. While other young men sought pleasure, Rockefeller sought perfection in his work. He was building an internal fortress of discipline and order, brick by meticulous brick. But just as he was escaping the chaos of his father, he was about to be drawn into a new kind of chaos, a wild, lawless frontier that would make Devil Bill's world look tame by comparison. In 1859, a former railroad conductor named Colonel Edwin Drake drilled a well in a remote corner of western Pennsylvania and struck oil. It triggered a frenzy, a black gold rush that was every bit as mad as the California gold rush a decade earlier. Fortune seekers poured into the region, a place that would soon be known as Sodom and Gomorrah. The oil fields were a scene of breathtaking disorder. Derricks sprouted like weeds, speculators scrambled over greasy slopes, and boomtowns appeared and vanished overnight. There were no rules, no systems, only a frantic, helter-skelter scramble for riches. It was, in other words, everything John D. Rockefeller despised. Rockefeller, then a young and prosperous produce merchant in Cleveland, didn't rush into oil. He studied it. He saw an industry plagued by the very same wild speculation and ruinous competition that he believed were the enemies of sound business. Prices swung violently from 10 cents a barrel to $10 a barrel in a single year. Refiners entered the business with tiny investments, hoping to make a quick killing, only to go bankrupt when the market turned. To Rockefeller, it was another sinking ship, another manifestation of the chaos he had spent his life trying to escape. But where others saw a gamble, Rockefeller saw a grand opportunity, not just to get rich, but to impose order. He believed God had put the oil in the ground for a purpose, to provide the world with cheap light. And he began to believe that he, John D. Rockefeller, had been chosen for a special mission, to tame this wild industry and bring it under rational control. In 1863, at the age of 24, he and a partner, Maurice Clark, backed a self-taught chemist named Samuel Andrews and opened a small oil refinery in Cleveland called the Excelsior Works. This was Rockefeller's entry into the business, not as a wildcatter drilling for oil, but as a refiner, a middleman, a processor. It was a calculated choice. Drilling was a lottery. Refining, in Rockefeller's hands, could become a science. From this small refinery, he began to execute the strategy that would make him the master of the oil world. The foundation principle was simple: economies of scale. He believed that by creating the largest, most efficient operation, he could drive down costs to a point where no one could compete. As he later said, the idea was that the larger the volume, the better the opportunities for the economies. He began to apply his mother's thrift on an industrial scale. He built his own barrels for less than half the going rate. He hired his own plumbers and bought his own pipes. He found ways to sell the waste products from refining, gasoline, paraffin, petroleum jelly, turning garbage into gold. Every single step of the process was studied, analyzed, and optimized to squeeze out another fraction of a cent in savings. Soon, his refining business was more profitable than his produce commission house. But his ambition was not just to be the most profitable refiner, it was to be the only refiner. The chaos of competition still tormented him. He saw it as wasteful, irrational, and unchristian. He had a vision of a new kind of business, a great cooperative that would bring all refiners together, end the destructive price wars, and stabilize the industry for the good of all. This vision, which he would call our plan, was beautiful and benevolent in his own mind. In the real world, its execution was brutal. In 1870, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with $1 million in capital, making it one of the largest corporations in the country. And then he began his conquest. The first target was his own backyard, the 26 rival refineries in Cleveland. In what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller, over a 6-week period in early 1872, devoured 22 of his competitors. His method was a stunning display of strategic brilliance and psychological warfare. He would approach a rival and, in his soft, melodious, preacher-like voice, lay out the grim reality. The industry was in a state of ruin. Only by combining could they save themselves. He would then make an offer: sell your refinery to me for a fair price, payable in either cash or Standard Oil stock. Take the stock, he would urge them. It will be for your good. But behind this gentle persuasion was an iron fist. Rockefeller had forged a secret alliance with the major railroads, a cartel called the South Improvement Company. This deal gave Standard Oil massive, secret rebates on its freight costs. Even more devastating, it gave them drawbacks: a fee for every barrel of oil shipped by their competitors. It meant that every time a rival made a sale, they were unknowingly paying a tribute to Rockefeller. It was a weapon of almost unparalleled cruelty. The threat was clear, even if it was unspoken: join me or be crushed. Most refiners, seeing the writing on the wall, sold out. Some took the cash and vanished. Those who took the stock became fantastically wealthy, partners in the very monopoly they once fought. Rockefeller saw this not as a hostile takeover, but as an act of mercy. He was the Moses, leading his competitors out of the desert of competition. The Standard, he said, was an angel of mercy, reaching down from the sky and saying, "Get into the ark." His vanquished rivals, however, did not see an angel. They saw a monster. They saw a man who had used secret deals and brute force to destroy them. The Cleveland Massacre was the original sin from which all of Rockefeller's other alleged crimes would spring. It made him the most powerful refiner in the world, but it also made him a pariah in the oil regions, a figure of hatred and fear. From Cleveland, the conquest rolled on. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. The oil regions themselves. One by one, the major refining centers fell under Standard Oil's control. Rockefeller absorbed hundreds of companies, often keeping their original names to create a network of bogus independents that gave the illusion of competition while secretly taking orders from 26 Broadway in New York. His intelligence network was legendary. He had spies everywhere, collecting data on every barrel of oil sold by competitors. He was the master puppeteer, pulling invisible strings that controlled an entire industry. By the early 1880s, his dream of order was nearly complete. To formalize his control, his lawyer, Samuel C. T. Dodd, devised an ingenious new legal structure: the trust. Shareholders of 40 different companies turned their stock over to a board of 9 trustees, including John and his brother William. In return, they received trust certificates, which entitled them to a share of the profits of the entire combination. The Standard Oil Trust, created in 1882, was the first great trust in American history. It was a holding company that allowed Rockefeller to centrally manage a vast, sprawling empire as if it were a single entity. By the end of the decade, Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of the oil refined in the United States. It owned the pipelines, the tank cars, and the storage facilities. It set prices, dictated terms to the railroads, and crushed any competitor who dared to challenge its dominance. John D. Rockefeller, the quiet boy from upstate New York who had been haunted by chaos, had become the absolute monarch of a global empire. He had imposed his will upon an industry, creating a machine of breathtaking efficiency and power. He was not yet 50 years old. The rest of the world, however, was just beginning to wake up to what he had built. And the backlash, when it came, would be ferocious. Just as Rockefeller reached the pinnacle of his power, a new kind of journalism was emerging, one dedicated to exposing the dark side of American life. These reporters, whom Teddy Roosevelt would later call muckrakers, saw men like Rockefeller not as captains of industry, but as robber barons. The first major shot was fired in 1881 by Henry Demarest Lloyd in the Atlantic Monthly, but the full-scale war began in November 1902, when McClure's magazine began publishing a series of articles by a journalist named Ida Minerva Tarbell. Tarbell was no stranger to the oil business. She had grown up in the heart of the Pennsylvania oil regions. Her father was an independent oil producer, one of the very men who had been squeezed by Rockefeller's relentless consolidation. She had seen firsthand the fear and hatred that Standard Oil inspired. For her, this was not just a story, it was a personal crusade. For 19 months, Tarbell laid out the sordid history of Standard Oil for a captivated national audience. She documented the secret deals, the railroad rebates, the industrial espionage, and the predatory pricing. She told the story of the Cleveland Massacre and the Widow Bacchus. She wrote with a cool, clinical precision that made the revelations all the more damning. The series was a sensation. It turned Rockefeller from an obscure, shadowy figure into the most hated man in America. He became the symbol of everything that was wrong with the new industrial order: the greed, the ruthlessness, the contempt for the common man. The press had a new name for his company: the Octopus. Rockefeller's response to this onslaught was a masterful display of silence. He believed that to answer his critics would be to dignify their lies. Let the world wag, was his attitude. He was confident that history would vindicate him. But his silence was misinterpreted as arrogance, as an admission of guilt. The political tide was turning. The public was clamoring for action against the trusts. And in the White House was a man who knew how to ride the waves of popular opinion: Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt saw Standard Oil as the quintessential bad trust and, armed with the findings of Tarbell's investigation, he unleashed the power of the federal government against it. In November 1906, the government filed a massive antitrust suit against Standard Oil, charging it with conspiracy to restrain trade and seeking its dissolution. The legal battles that followed were epic. For years, Rockefeller became the world's richest fugitive, dodging subpoenas and hiding out on his vast estates. When he was finally forced to testify, he was a master of evasion, a sweet, forgetful old man who couldn't seem to remember a thing about the business he had built. But the evidence was overwhelming. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court handed down its verdict. Standard Oil was found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act and was ordered to be broken up. The Great Trust, the creation that had been Rockefeller's life's work, the monument he had built to the principle of order, was to be dismantled. When the news reached him, Rockefeller was on the golf course at his Pocentino estate. He read the telegram, showed no emotion, and then turned to his golfing partner. "Shall we go on, gentlemen?" he asked. It seemed like the final, crushing defeat. The end of an empire. But the story of John D. Rockefeller is never that simple. The breakup of Standard Oil, the act that was meant to be his punishment, turned out to be the single most profitable event of his life. The old trust was dissolved into 34 separate companies. As a shareholder of the parent company, Rockefeller received a proportionate stake in each of the new entities. And as the age of the automobile dawned, the value of these companies exploded. The stock of Standard Oil of Indiana soared from $3,500 to $9,500 in less than a year. The man who was worth an estimated $300 million at the time of the breakup was worth nearly $900 million just 2 years later. The government, in trying to slay the dragon, had only succeeded in creating a whole brood of smaller, fantastically profitable dragons, and Rockefeller owned a piece of them all. He had already retired from the day-to-day management of Standard Oil in the mid-1890s, turning the reins over to his fiery protégé, John D. Archbold. His health had begun to fail, and he suffered from a strange digestive malady and a condition called alopecia, which caused him to lose all of his hair, including his eyebrows and eyelashes, giving him the haunting, mummified appearance that became his public image. But his retirement was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the start of his second, and perhaps even more astonishing, career. Rockefeller had always believed it was his religious duty not just to get money, but to give it away. "God gave me my money," he said, and he saw himself as a trustee, a steward of that divine gift. Now, with a fortune rolling up like an avalanche, as his chief philanthropic advisor Frederick T. Gates put it, he faced a new challenge: how to give away money on a scale the world had never seen, and to do it wisely. He approached philanthropy with the same systematic, visionary mindset he had brought to business. He didn't want to just give alms to the poor, he wanted to attack the root causes of human misery. He called it wholesale philanthropy. He created institutions that would, in their own way, be as revolutionary as Standard Oil. He founded the University of Chicago, turning a struggling Baptist college into a world-class university almost overnight by raiding the faculties of Harvard and Yale. He poured millions into it, creating a great center of learning and research in the heart of the Midwest. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the first institution in America devoted solely to biomedical research. He hired the brilliant Drive Simon Flexner to run it, and the institute went on to produce a string of Nobel laureates and medical breakthroughs, from a cure for spinal meningitis to the development of a yellow fever vaccine. He created the General Education Board, which launched a massive campaign to eradicate hookworm in the South, a disease that had afflicted millions and was mistaken for simple laziness. The campaign was a spectacular success, freeing an entire region from a debilitating plague. And in 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation, with a mission that was as simple as it was audacious: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. It would become the largest and most influential philanthropic organization on earth. The man who had been reviled as a monster was now being hailed as a saint. The transformation was slow, but it was undeniable. In his old age, he became a beloved, almost mythical figure. The wizened old codger in his golf knickers, handing out shiny new dimes to children and telling them to save their money. He was Neighbor John, the kindly old gentleman who sang hymns at church and loved a good joke. He lived to be almost 98 years old, outlasting his critics, his partners, and even his own dark reputation. When he died in 1937, the obituaries focused not on the robber baron, but on the philanthropist. But the contradictions remained. And they were passed down to his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Jr. was everything his grandfather, Devil Bill, was not. He was serious, dutiful, and consumed by a sense of moral responsibility. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's infamy, and he dedicated his life to cleansing the family name. He was the one who had to confront the dark legacy of Standard Oil, most painfully during the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, when striking miners and their families were killed at a Colorado coal mine owned by the family. That event was a brutal awakening for Jr. It forced him to break from his father's hardline anti-union stance and pioneer new forms of industrial relations. It was Jr. who would build Rockefeller Center, restore colonial Williamsburg, and create the national parks at Acadia and the Grand Tetons. He was the steward, the conscience of the family, the man who turned the Rockefeller fortune into a permanent force for public good. But he could never fully escape the shadow of his father. Just as John D. Sr. was haunted by Devil Bill, Jr. was haunted by the towering, enigmatic figure of Sr. It was a dynasty built on a profound and enduring contradiction. Commentary. When you close a book like Titan, you're left with a sense of awe, not just at the scale of Rockefeller's fortune, but at the sheer force of his will. Here was a man who, from the humblest and most chaotic of beginnings, imposed an astonishing degree of order on the world around him. And I think that's the first great lesson we can take from his life. Rockefeller wasn't just a businessman, he was an architect of systems. While his competitors were gambling on drilling the next great well, he was methodically building a machine, an integrated system of refining, transport, and marketing, that made him immune to the gamble. He understood a principle that is so crucial for anyone with a big ambition. Goals are temporary, but systems are permanent. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. His goal wasn't just to be rich. His system was to create a business so efficient, so dominant, that wealth was the inevitable byproduct. Think about that in your own life. What's one area where you feel like you're constantly struggling, where things feel chaotic and unpredictable? Your studies? Your health? Your finances? Instead of just setting a goal, ask yourself, what system could I build that would make success the natural outcome? Rockefeller started with a simple ledger book, a system for tracking every penny. It seems small, but it was the foundation of everything that followed. The second lesson is about the power of a quiet mind. Rockefeller was surrounded by blustering, loud, aggressive men. The railroad barons, the wildcatters, his own father. But he cultivated silence. He listened more than he spoke. He let his opponents exhaust themselves with anger while he sat calmly, thinking, planning. In a world that prizes noise and speed, Rockefeller teaches us that true power often lies in patience, in deliberation, in the ability to keep your own counsel while others lose their heads. As he once said, success comes from keeping the ears open and the mouth closed. But the most profound, and perhaps most difficult lesson from Rockefeller's life is about the nature of legacy. For decades, his legacy was one of ruthless greed. He was the most hated man in America. Yet today, when we hear the name Rockefeller, we think of medical breakthroughs, of great universities, of national parks. We think of philanthropy on a scale that is still, to this day, breathtaking. Does the good he did in the end wash away the questionable methods he used to acquire his fortune? It's a question without an easy answer. Chernow's book doesn't try to give us one. Instead, it presents us with the full, unvarnished picture of a man who was both a creator and a destroyer. A man who believed he was an instrument of God, even as he engaged in acts that many saw as profoundly unchristian. His life forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that human beings are complex, contradictory creatures. We are capable of immense good and immense harm, sometimes in the very same breath. And perhaps the greatest challenge of life is not to be perfect, but to find a way to make our good outweigh our bad. To build something that lasts, something that serves others, even if the foundation is laid with imperfect materials. Rockefeller wasn't a saint. He was a deeply flawed, deeply human man who bent the world to his will. But in the end, he also used that same will to leave the world a profoundly better place than he found it. And in that epic, 50-year struggle between his two selves, the son of Devil Bill and the son of Eliza, lies a story for the ages. That was a summary of Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller, Sr. by Ron Chernow. We've certainly touched on the major themes and stories today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is just a map. The real journey happens when you explore the territory yourself. The true power of this book is in the rich detail, the nuance, the quiet moments where a story or a quote makes you stop and think about your own life in a new way. This summary is meant to be a starting point, to help you decide if this is a journey you want to take. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity, I can't recommend this book highly enough. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's about understanding the very DNA of ambition, power, and the complex art of building a legacy. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, If you found this summary valuable and it gave you something to think about, please do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that we're on the right track, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the Billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.